Hey there, and welcome to this video. I'm so glad you stopped by. My name is Matt Petrowski. I'm guessing you're here to learn a little bit more about FileMaker, and that's what I'm here to teach you. In this lesson, what we're taking a look is a continuation of our series about our time tracking database, and we're looking at saving user preferences. So if you'll stick with me, we'll be on my desktop learning in just a few. All right, so if you've been following these in sequence, then you'll know that yesterday I left you with a homework assignment, and we'll get to that in just a second. But for those of you that found this video as a result of a YouTube search or a referral or what have you, you can see we're on, what is it? We're on lesson 18, I think, right now, or 17. I lose track of the day sometimes. But click on the channel icon that you find down below. That channel icon will take you to my channel here on YouTube. You'll be able to find 3 other series of videos that I've produced. If you go all the way back to series 1 and you start and watch all of the hours, I am convinced that you will become a very proficient FileMaker developer. I'm developing this software as we go along, just focusing on every single little detail. Which brings me to the file. If you would like to follow along in this video with the file that I'm going to have open here as I open it, called Time Track, we've been developing this database. You can click on the link. You're going to find it in the description. Click on the Show More, and that should be there. So one of the things that we talked about in the previous lesson was we talked about state and what we wanted to achieve. And one of those is this right here. Let me show the status area so that FileMaker looks a little familiar to us. Was when we make a selection from this popover, we are using a script trigger. That script trigger is the onObjectSave because it's a global. We could use the onObjectModify, but I chose the onObjectSave, which you can use with globals because as soon as you finish putting a value into a global, it is by default saved. But that's a lot different than when you commit data to the record and that's sent to FileMaker server. So a save in global is different than a save in a regular field. But when we make a selection here, a script is running, and one of the issues that I pointed out with the previous video, responsive user interface, was the fact that when I had this popover shown, a user would come in here and they would make switches and nothing would happen in the user interface. And it's my responsibility and yours as the developer to make sure that we get some responsive UI, some consistency. So we've solved that problem here in this video. And you can see that when I click these options, the list behind modifies and updates. It's executing the same script that we saw in the previous video. Go watch that one if you came to this video and haven't seen that. But you can see that it is modifying as I click, but the popover is staying active. Now, the way that we do this is so simple, it's almost silly. FileMaker should have an option, I think, but I don't know where they would put it right now in the user interface to persist this particular popover. Well, the only way that we can do that is by tracking a variable, in this case, a global variable that says, what is the popover that's open? What was the name of that popover? And can we go back to that? So whenever we have multiple questions like that, whenever we say, okay, was the popover open? Yes or no? What was the name of the popover? And when we return, can we return to it? We want to boil those down to as few options in terms of the script as possible. So this is what I love about programming. In programming, I could have done this with 2 different variables. I could have done it with the first variable being, is the popover open, yes or no? And then additionally, what's the name of the popover if it's open or if it's closed? But here's what's cool about programming. If you boil things down to their core fundamental piece of information, you can usually get rid of a lot of excess items. So in this case, we've got this popover, and let's take a look at what happens. Oh, my FileMaker's crashing there. I'm getting the spinning circle. I don't know what's going on. It came back. Good. Whoosh. Didn't want to have to deal with that. All right, so in layout mode here, when we take a look at the popover, and we go in and we focus on that. I'm going to hold down the Command key and double click on that. And we're going to see that we have the two options that we have: what happens when the popover opens and closes. So here I'm running the onObjectEnter. So when we enter into the popover, and what happens when we exit the popover. Now I have a script that I have named Popover Object Name. Now when we select on this and we select right here, the name of the object is not as critical on the onObjectExit in terms of what's going to happen. In fact, we want it to pass nothing to this particular script. What's most important is when we enter into the popover. So you can see that there is a parameter on this popover. So when we select this, we can see that the popover is named, quite aptly, Popover.Options. Now, if you don't know, I've explained this in previous videos. I always give my object names a prefix of whatever object it is, because if I'm dealing with a bunch of different objects, then you know clearly what is what by just simply using the same conventions that FileMaker uses. It's a popover, call it a popover. So we can see when we look at the popover, and please don't confuse the button of a popover with the popover itself. They are distinctly different objects. So with the popover selected, where I've got my bounds all shown right here, I can see that I named that object Popover Options. So when this popover, I hate it when FileMaker does that. You accidentally click and it shifts it to one of the sides. To fix it, you would just simply go in and you can control whatever side the popover is on. I want it underneath. When we run this script, we can look at how simple this script is. It's crazy simple. So it is right here, Popover Object. One step. That's all there is to this one script. There's nothing more. There's nothing complex. Remember, I just stated we had two different things that we were considering. Is the popover open, yes or no? And then what's the name of the popover if it's open? Well, sometimes if you boil those down, you get a much more succinct response of, if I have a name, that implies that the popover's open, right? If I don't have a name, then the popover's probably not open. And this will work across all of the popovers that are on the current layout, whichever one. All you have to do is make this script, or this script called as a subscript, part of the onObjectEnter and the onObjectClose for the given popover. So you can see right here, I've given you a note. It's super simple and it only does one thing. It just saves the name of the object of the popover. Now I have dedicated it to popovers because popovers in particular, if you think about it, you can only ever, in any FileMaker user interface, have one popover open at a time. You can never, ever, ever have 2, 3, 4. You can only have one. So we're going to dedicate this script to that one popover, and we can take a look at how it works when we go into, save the layout changes, go use our very comfortable and familiar data viewer. You should be using FileMaker Advanced if you consider FileMaker development something important. And just watch what happens when we click that popover. Let's make it so that we can see. I like to see the name, so we'll scroll that out. Let's put it over here. We click the popover, and popover object exists. That's because we hit the onEnter, so we simply just set the name of that object. And I could have called this popover name, popover object name, however you want to name your variables. But what happens when it closes? When it closes, it runs that same script, but it's passing in an empty value. What happens to a global variable when you assign an empty value? Quite simply, it goes away. So the solution to this in our script that is being run here, here, and here is to simply account for and look for this global variable. If it exists, then we're going to target the object. If it does not exist, then we're not going to target the object. And so when we go look at the script, which you have in your copy if you've downloaded, and we look at the onObject load times, I'll scroll out a little bit here, we can see one thing we do need to account for is the fact that any time that you do something from the context of a popover and it goes somewhere else, if you go to another layout, if you go to a different view from browse, from list view to form view or to table view, if you load a set of records by executing a query, which we've done right here, Before you ever do those things, you have to save the name of the object. So we've got a little bit of duplicate code here in that we have to save the name into a local variable to this script. We've got to capture what is in Popover object. Now, if nothing is in Popover object when this script is run, then down at the bottom you will see that we really don't need to go. We'll attempt to go to a non-existing object. Now, when we do that, with this turned on, the set error capture, it's of no consequence. FileMaker tries to go there, it fails, that's okay. We don't care about the failure. But if there is a value in the global of Popover object, it's captured here before we do anything. We execute our find, which is everything right there, and then we go into our list view if that happens. But down at the bottom, you can see that we just put a go-to object, go to the Popover. So either there is going to be something in here, the name of an object, or there's not. And if there's not, then there's no consequence. And by default, we are refreshing each of these as, and we would refresh however many objects there are, because we decided yesterday in the previous lesson, because this is tied to the operations of what happened within that Popover, that's what we're just going to do. We're going to put it into this script rather than using a separate script and giving ourselves more to maintain, because they sort of go hand in hand on this. And so that's our solution to the Popover. It's super simple. I mean, anytime that you have a Popover on screen, all you have to do is use a dedicated script with that one step, and you can maintain your state. I can click and unclick all of these, and it will update in the background, and it's acting like I would expect for the user interface. So we're all good. All right, so that was a good little 11-minute lesson right there, but we're not going to leave with that because the title of today's lesson was Saving Preferences. So I have discussed in previous videos how I like to save preferences, at least in this type of solution. This is a very focused solution where it's going to be doing just one specific thing, in this case time tracking. It may evolve, but I didn't come in building this solution thinking it's going to be an invoicing, estimating, inventory tracking, just a monolithic database. If I had, I would have created a dedicated preferences table and stored them a little bit differently. But in this case, when we take a look at this, when we zoom in, look at our Popover, currently we have two options, omit invoiced and exclude start times. Now, I would like to save these preferences for myself as a logged in user. And fortunately, in this database, we've already taken care of it. I believe we set it up in the data and structure part, but as I go to, which I typically bring up dialog boxes, and I should be in the habit every video of making note of it. I'm basically using a shortcut key of the layouts or the defined database. Remember, from all the way back in the Learning FileMaker environment, the top half of this dialog under Manage is where you're spending most of your time. Define database, layouts, and scripts. The three where you spend the most amount of time have key equivalents. Remember those. You'll use them a lot. So in our users table, we are opting to store preferences. So as I open this up, and you can click open on your copy as well, storing the user preferences is really going to boil down to a pretty simple approach in order to store them. Now, we've only got two preferences currently, and it's a good idea for us to get ahead of the game and start to create routines to save the preferences now and make it easy on us so that as users choose options within the user interface, we preserve those preferences. So what's that going to look like? In here, when we go into our tools and we take a look at our data viewer, we have these two options right now. Me as the current user of this database, and we can always see who the current user is either by putting it into the user interface or clicking creating a watch variable and saying get account name. I, as the current logged in user, I am admin. So this could be Matt, it could be the name of any user, whatever. I want to store my preferences for admin of these two options, omit invoiced and exclude starts. Now, the way that I like to store these preferences is, again, super simple. I just want to save these as a text string, but I'm going to save them as a text string that means something to FileMaker. So let's look at this. Let's take the values of omit invoiced and exclude starts. And I'm going to do a little cheat here, and I always like to copy my code. I'm going to select right here because I know that on each of these in the data table, I already have them right here. And I'm just going to copy them. I like to copy and paste rather than trying to go from memory. So omit invoiced is 1, and I'm just going to switch over to my table right here, and I'm going to put that, let's find out who the admin user is. Admin is the first record. I have a test user as well. I'm going to put them in the preferences field the way that they need to be saved. So I'm going to paste omit invoiced, and I'm going to say it's going to be equal to, I'm going to say 1 for right now, because I'm going to assume that that's a preference that I would like to save. I'm going to then put a semicolon. I'm going to hit return, and I'm going to go get the other value. And hopefully you, if you have watched a few of my videos, will start to see what this format is. Equals, let's say that one's 0. All right, so what format is this right here? Where have we seen this before? And hopefully your answer is, I saw this in your learning the let function, or I saw this when you used the let function. This is an internal structure known to FileMaker that we can take advantage of when we're going to store data. What's great about this is we already have a structure set up such that we are going to see this on startup. If we go into the defined database with Command Shift D and we go to our relationships, going back to a previous video where we talk about creating users, this is our target table occurrence when this solution loads, because it's going to be fast, it's not loading any data, it's not targeting a specific table occurrence where there's a lot of data, and it is directly connected to the users. So at the point that this solution starts up, the very first thing that this solution is going to be able to see is into the users table, and it's going to be able to see this particular field of preferences. And the only thing that we're going to have to do is simply evaluate this. So let's take a look at what that's going to look like. We're going to go into the data viewer, into our watch variable, and currently our omit invoiced and our exclude starts does not match what our preferences are set. So I'm going to create a watch variable here, and it's going to look like this. We're going to go and say let, I'll actually type in my shortcut that expands out. You do not have a copy of this unless you're running Typinator, which Typinator is simply, it's an application that you can get on the Macintosh. It's a key expansion. So when I type in let here, and if I hit let and type return, that's going to give me FileMaker's implementation of the function. Please realize I'm using an expansion keyword tool. It's an additional piece of software that's saying when I type in fmlet, it's expanding out a pre-formatted format that I like of how to deal with let functions. But if we select this and we now paste what we had that we started to presume as a let function, and we do something like this, we take this off and we say the calculation result, I really don't care about the result. To be quite honest, I can give this an empty result. I can give it, whatever I want. The point is, I'm using only the top portion of this let function in order to make these values be what they are from preferences. So when the file starts up, the file is going to look at the user preferences field. It's going to be populated with only this portion of the data, only the internal part of a let function. And then the rest of my script, my startup script that's going to run, it's going to say, basically, if you find this content, just make sure and evaluate it, and it instantly creates all of the settings for that user, at least based on when they were previously logged into the system. So the only issue that we have right now, because we now know how we're going to save the preferences, we're just going to save them as plain text. That plain text is going to meet the requirements of a particular FileMaker function, in this case, the let function. all we have to do is come up with a system of how do we want to manage and set these values. And there's a number of ways that we could do this. I have done this in the past using a custom function where that custom function instantiates, in particular, and this is a little bit more complex. This is probably advanced, but I think you can get you wrap your head around this. Variables. So follow along with me here. In the past, I've used a custom function, and that custom function, every time that I create a variable, gets created and stored as a name into a variable's variable. So this is a little bit confusing, but within this variable's variable, in fact, I'll go ahead and create this right now. This is how easy it is. As soon as I do this, what's going to happen is FileMaker has already evaluated this because of this option, automatically evaluate, and it's failing right now. But if I say variables equals and I just set it to nothing, if I want to see the value of that, I can always return that as the result. Let's see, currently variables is nothing, it doesn't exist. If I want to see what's in here, you can see that that's a 0. If I want to see what's in here, I can see that's a 1. So what would get stored is, using this custom function, is something like this. And this is going to be a little bit confusing if you're a new FileMaker learner, but hopefully it will make sense over time, because we're not going to do it in this fashion, but it's information that's worthwhile to know. It's a bit tricky. So what is currently stored in the global variable variables? A list of all of the variables that I want to store. Then you write a routine that basically walks across all of this data and says, get the current value of omit invoiced and say what you want it to be equal to. Get the current value of exclude starts and say what you want it to be equal to. So basically I was using a global variable for the purpose of storing the names of other variables. Little tricky, isn't it? But it does work, and it's a system that can be made pretty effective. We're not going to do that. We're going to take a little bit of an easier approach here, something that's a little bit more explicit and gives us a clearer idea or a clearer picture of what we're tracking in terms of our variables. So let's see what that's going to look like. I'll go ahead and monitor that one, and we'll go to our current, and we will now go into our scripts and start to set up the foundation for managing our preferences. So we know that we want to store the preferences in a certain way, and let's close that window, and let's go to our startup routine. So everything here boils down to what happens when the solution starts up and when it shuts down. When it shuts down is when we're going to want to save all of these values into this particular field. Well, we have a couple of options. We can, at the point in time that we shut the application down, basically walk across all of the possible individual variables that are saving preferences and push those into this one field. But let's think about this for a second. What's the problem in that approach? Let's throw in some scenarios. What happens if the solution crashes at the point in time? That means that if the solution crashed and the FileMaker database went down, and the only time that we save all of the different individual preferences that the user has set, if we do it at the very end of a process and FileMaker has quit before that, that never happens, and we didn't save the user preferences. So how does the operating system of the computers that we use do it? Well, basically each time that you click a checkbox or change any type of preference setting, it immediately saves that particular preference setting. Hence, that's why I used a custom function in the method that I used. We can come up with that, but let's start with the more basic. Let's have all of the preferences all in one place. So we're going to need to create a script, of course, and we can call it preferences. And again, I'm shooting these videos live, so I'm evolving a lot of this stuff as I do this right here. I'm just programming a solution. I'm going to do a set variable. And when I said that I wanted to make something that's a little more transparent so I can see what are all of the preferences rather than something that's a little more obscure, such as setting a variable of variables to the names of the variables that I want to store and using a custom function, we're going to put each one in a given script. So we're going to specify, and we're going to say this. We're going to say set omitted invoice. Oh, did I think I want to undo that because I want to cut this one too before I get rid of all that. So this is what's going to be, I want that not there. Okay, this is a trick I have to do. There we go, cut that one there. I had to move it into the upper field there. So we'll just save that one. We'll hit Command or Control D, and then we'll put in the other. So this is the basis. I mean, we're really not doing a whole lot here. We are starting to say we want omit invoiced to be this. We want set exclude starts to be this. But we've got a little ways to go, and we're going to have to think about this and evolve the system. But part of our goal is to be able to go into a script aptly called preferences that's simply just going to give us a visual way to list and see all of the different preferences. Now, you can compare and contrast that to having a variables variable, where here I could just double click and see that's the same thing to me, in essence. I can see that I'm going to be saving a variable called omit invoiced, exclude starts, and the only difference is that I'm simply not storing the double dollar signs here. And we always know that you can prepend or append data at any point in time. So even if this was just a list of just the values, I can always, if I created a loop, as I walk across each of these values, just prepend a double dollar sign in front of them. In fact, I like to do that because sometimes your code may accidentally do something like this, where these are two distinctly different variables. This, as a variable, is a lot different than this in terms of how it's used. And so regardless of my conventions of naming something all caps, it doesn't matter if I named it all caps. If FileMaker only saw $1 sign, that's a local variable, and that would not persist across the whole solution. That would only persist for the length of a lifetime of a script, being a local variable. We'll have to get into that in the scripting session, or in scripting sessions that I do. So we are at 27 minutes, and I'm enjoying leaving you with homework, and that's because it gets you to critically think about, how could I do this? How could I solve the problem of saving all of these variables? I want to save them not necessarily at the end of the solution run, because I want to prevent that crash from not saving my variables. How can I do this in a way with scripts such that I save these so that they constantly get added to this particular field? Now, one of the issues that we're going to come across is if we save the values at each time that we're going to save them into this field, you have to be aware that this potential exists right here. Invoiced right there equals 0. So what's, is that the same? I think it is. I'll copy and paste it just in case. No, it wasn't. I missed a letter. So in this particular case, what happens is if we don't look for the fact that the value already exists, and we just add on a new one, let's say omit invoiced is a particular option that's not just on that one button that we saw, but there's another place in my solution, another layout where I allow omit invoice to be changed. Well, I can't just continually add these new items over and over and over again. I have to come up with a solution. Now, if you're working with FileMaker 16, you have the built-in solution and you're lucky. If you don't have FileMaker 16, if you've got FileMaker 15, 14, 13, you have to take a little bit of a longer approach, and this is what's going to be your homework. How do you determine whether a value exists within a particular field? And I'll give you the first few syllables, pattern, and then you figure out the rest. It's a function where you're going to determine whether a value exists. Now, if it does not exist, then you are going to append it on. If it does exist, then you want to swap it out, then you're going to have to remove it and then append the value that you want. Now, there is a function. I will go over to the web browser, and I will open up, let's see, GitHub and FileMaker standards, I think. FileMaker standards, and I will scroll down to the function that I have used in the past. It is this one right here, value toggle FM. I'll put that in as a link for right now. This is a custom function that you can use, which uses that function that I alluded to, the that function right there, pattern. Use the pattern count in order to determine whether it exists, and if it doesn't, then you're going to swap it off. Now, what's the easy way in FileMaker 16? Well, let's take a look at that. We have a field that's going to be storing all of our preferences in a internal let formatted way. It's just text. The easy way in FileMaker, as I reference this particular field, I'll create a new watch variable here, and I will reference the users table of the preferences. It will show me that I can't have this because if the intended is omit invoiced is set to a setting of 1, but then later I get this one, whatever comes last in FileMaker, overwrites the first. So the easiest way to do this would be to just switch up your logic. Instead of appending a new value to the end, and this is, again, FileMaker 16 and moving forward. In FileMaker 15, 14, 13, whatever, you have to use that value toggle function, where you have to use a pattern count. But here in FileMaker 16, what I can do is whatever value I want to be used as the absolute value, I'm going to prepend it. So I'm going to make sure that it is in the front. And then what I'm going to do is on this, with FileMaker 16, I am going to use, we've already seen it before, unique values. And unique values, when I put in preferences, it's supposed to take that away. That's why. It's not a unique value. And I know why, because this as a string does not match this. And what I have done is I'm mixing my thought process here in terms of my variables, because in my variables, this is one of the ways that I do this. If I reference that variable, let's go change it right there. I'll show you what I'm talking about. Don't get confused by what I'm saying right here. Variables is what I'm thinking about. This is the situation that I'm thinking about with the unique list. So use that value toggle function that I just showed you. Use that one to get a value on or off. But if a value is set to that value, that's the problem that we come across. It's probably why I use the custom function, and I'll probably have to implement that into this file that we'll get in the next video. Because when we go take a look at that watch variable again, don't confuse by the fact that I'm flipping back and forth between looking at variables and just coming into a watch variable. I'm simply just using the data viewer here to go into a FileMaker calculation dialog box. If all this switching back and forth is making you confused, I am simply just double-clicking here to open a calculation dialog box. If I look at unique values of variables, I get just a pure list. I don't get any duplicates, where our intention here is if you're going to store your preferences in this manner, if you're going to store them within a field, you want to absolutely make sure that you only have one of any given single preference. Otherwise, as I just stated, whatever comes last is going to be king, and that's the one that's going to override whatever came first. And so when things don't work the way that you expect, it may be because you haven't accounted for that. And so I know that I've explained two different systems here, and I'm leaving you with a situation where it's up to you to sort of start to try to think about what's the system that you would use. I may implement the custom function system because I already have that one fleshed out, and it works and I like it. I wanted to do something a little bit more simple, and so I'll probably think about that after the video, to think about a purely script solution and one that's more transparent where you can see all of the variables. But as far as the data is concerned, it may be just fine looking at a global variable of intended global variables. And I hope that makes sense. But unique values will basically ensure that I only have one of any given variable. And another thing to note is, in the rest of computing, as I've learned in programming, whenever you're using the name for something rather than an ID, and usually a number or a string is typically in computing, it's referenced as a UID or a UUID, something in the ID branch of things. When you use a string of text where that string of text is canonical, meaning there is one and only one that is going to represent anything, I've heard that called a machine name. So in other words, in the rest of the internet, a machine name for a particular website is its domain. That is the only place that that one domain name can be used. It can be put on other machines, but from the standpoint of it being canonical, meaning there's one and only one that is the true one, that domain only should exist on that one machine. So in this case, in my whole solution, as a machine name being canonical, this should only ever exist and manage one value, and yeah, it's in one place. All right, so let's see if we have any questions from today. We will put in a solution. I will probably have that in the next version of this file in the next video, and we'll be able to start to save our preferences, but I think you get the idea that it's pretty simple. That's all we have to do, store a string of text, and all that string of text has to be is something that matches what FileMaker would expect to be able to evaluate. And we'll look at that evaluate in the next part of this series. All right, so let's switch over 35 minutes. I am going to switch to, there we go, our chat. I'll need to refresh that window, which happens right there. And we'll see, we've got all of the board trying to keep over the popover. Well, we've got the solution to that now. Thank you, Lee. Hey, Rana, I'm following your lesson and downloading them. My hard disk is now... YouTube will keep them for all of time unless YouTube kicked me off. But you are definitely welcome to download those YouTube videos. All right, hello from Kiev, Ukraine. Is it often much easier to remake a solution from scratch than redo some parts in a bad way? You know, that's a good question. I have taught this in some of my advanced classes of when it comes to FileMaker, and let me give you a quick answer to this particular solution. In FileMaker, one of the advantages that we have is the data is already here. But one of the things that because there's no separation in FileMaker, in other words, everything I call FileMaker a ball of wax application, because this whole graph really represents the data structure of your solution. And then the scripts are tied inherently to how things are wired up here. The problem is you've sort of locked yourself into a particular structure and into a particular way of thinking. But what some FileMaker developers don't necessarily anticipate is the fact that you can build multiple solutions within a FileMaker file. In other words, there is nothing that prevents me from creating a separate table occurrence and other table occurrences and thus wiring them up and having a completely separate set of layouts, scripts, and everything else built within this solution. Now, the problem is I've now got two completely separate systems within this one FileMaker file. And I can have, let's say, 90% of the users working on this part of the solution while I have a separate set of users, the other 10%, beta testing on a completely different solution within this same file. I call it solution within a solution. But the problem is, yes, you have a lot of commingled stuff now within this one file, and you have to go through and rip out what you don't want to use once you've pushed users over to using the new beta structure or the new way of the solution. So the question then boils down to, is it easier to just start a completely separate file? That again really comes down to how you're using FileMaker. Sometimes it is better to create a completely separate file, but sometimes, I've found this to be the case, the data is already here in this file. Sometimes it's better to take this approach, start to develop the solution, and then once you find out that it's proving to be more effective, mirror your development efforts. And yes, it does duplicate your efforts, but mirror what you've built here as a second solution within this file into another file. And the great thing about FileMaker is that copy and paste, once things are the same in two different files, if I had this exact table occurrence and this exact table occurrence in another file, if I was to copy and paste scripts, it will work. So as long as things are named the same, and FileMaker bases a lot of things off of internal IDs, but also off of just the same name. If you use the same names in a separate file, you can copy and paste a whole lot. So you're not duplicating that much effort when it comes to revamping a solution. The biggest thing is you want to take advantage of the fact that the data is already here, and some of the structures that you've already created and you are familiar with, you're just going to replicate them within the same file just as a separate set of table occurrences. Just something to think about. So good question. I like that. All right, let's switch back here and take a look because it definitely seems so, or should I view this as an opportunity to learn? Hopefully that answer, tut or toot, gives you a good answer there. Almost everything I knew and done in FM before your video lessons now seems wrong on so many levels. You know, learning FileMaker or learning anything new, it is definitely a process, and what you knew before and what you know later always makes you reevaluate why the heck did I do something before. And so that's why I'm putting out these videos, to give people just alternative ways to think about things. All right, and it looks like that was our last question. So for today, I think we are heading out to our wrap. So let's make sure that's going. Oh, I clicked it twice there. Technology, Butterfingers. All right. Thank you so much for tuning into this video. I hope you got a lot of value from it individually, or if you're following it in series. Of course, you can subscribe right here on YouTube and be notified via YouTube app or whatever. Subscribe to the magazine up above in order to get more information, and the next video in this series will probably be coming up right here. So I'd like to wish you much luck with your own FileMaker development, and until next time, happy FileMaking.